In this video, we are going to finish off the Frank animation by animating the other arm. You could continue on with the process that we did in the last video by selecting the hand and arm layer and copying them, flipping them, taking away the animation that we've done already, and then redoing that. We're going to be doing the first two of those things, flipping it and taking away the animation. But we're going to then reanimate it using some other tools, specifically the puppet pin tool up here in the toolbox. So to continue on, select the hand and arm layer. I'll just point out my hand layer is still parented to the arm layer. I'm going to duplicate these by pressing Command D on my keyboard. And you can see I now have the arm 2 and hand 2 layers. I'm going to just select arm 2 and bring it up underneath hand 2 so those two layers are together. And you'll notice that the parenting has also been updated. Hand 2 is parented to the correct arm 2. Just to make this a little bit simpler, I'm going to hide the hand and arm layer from the previous exercise. Let's reveal the keyframes that we added in the last animation by pressing U on our keyboard. If you don't see it right away, you may have to press U another time. You can see that we are looking at the properties that we animated in the last video. What I'd like you to do is remove all the animation that we did on that arm previously by just clicking on the stopwatches next to each of these animated properties. I now have the hand and the arm in their neutral beginning positions. Now I want to reposition this arm and flip it over to the other side. I'm going to select both of these layers here in my timeline by holding Shift, and I'm going to carefully click and drag these layers over to the right hand side. I'm going to rotate the arm's rotation value just so that I can get it into roughly the right angle to begin this animation, and then carefully I'm going to click, and again I'm just going to reposition that so it's on the screen like this. Now you could animate this arm like we did the last arm using the After Effects pen tool and the Convert Vertex tool. However, as I mentioned, we're going to do our animation using the puppet pin tools. The puppet pin tool is a limited animation tool. However, it is really good for creating small, subtle movements. And sometimes that's all your animation calls for. So that's what we're going to do with this arm. But in order to do that, I'm going to need to combine the hand 2 layer and arm 2 layer into one composition so that I can animate it all together. This will be a limitation. We won't be able to do the hand rotation like we did last time. Like I say, the puppet tool is good in certain occasions. I'm going to hold down my Shift button to select those 2 layers, and we are going to create a new comp by coming to the layer drop-down menu and selecting Pre-Compose, or Command Shift C on our keyboards. And I'm going to name this composition arm. We're not going to worry left or right at the moment. Move all attributes into the new composition has been checked by default because there are no attributes to be moved at the moment. There's no effects or anything like that. The adjust composition duration is unchecked. I'm going to ask you to check on this button here, Open New Composition. It's going to open up this arm composition, and there's one small change I want to make in that arm composition before we proceed. Say OK. There I am in my arm composition. You'll notice though that the composition size is the size of the composition window we were just in. But I would like this composition to be just the size of this arm. And we can do that easily because there is an option in the bottom of our composition window that I'm hovering over right now called Region of Interest. I want you to select the Region of Interest button, and you'll see you have a crosshairs, and I'm just going to drag a bounding box around my arm and hand. I can reposition that to make that even tighter still. It doesn't matter all that much, but make sure you don't cut off any parts of the graphics. Now that I've defined that region of interest, I'm going to come to my composition drop-down menu and select Crop Comp to Region of Interest. When I come back to my main animation, the arm, if I can click on it and move it back into view, the composition is now just the size of the arm and hand. We will have to reposition our anchor point, however. You'll see that our anchor point is no longer at the shoulder. But remember, we can do this easily by coming over to our anchor point tool in our toolbox and clicking on the anchor point and just moving it over top of our shoulder position. Okay, let's move that arm into its beginning neutral position. And now in order for me to position the puppet pins to animate, I am going to need to rotate this arm into view. So I'm going to reveal this layer's rotation value by selecting that arm and pressing R. And I'm just going to click and drag on that 0, 0, drag it to the left so that the arm is now in view like that. Now that I have that in position, I'm going to come up to my toolbox and click once and hold on my puppet pin tool. And you can see I have a variety of subtools underneath that puppet pin. There is the standard puppet position pin tool, puppet starch pin tool, puppet bend pin tool, puppet advanced pin tool, and then we have something called puppet overlap pin tool. I said this earlier, I think that the puppet pin tool is best used in moderation. It's not really as featured as it might sound, but it does provide some simple tools to create subtle animation, as we'll see here. We're going to start by choosing this puppet advanced pin tool and clicking once roughly where the anchor point is right now. This advanced puppet pin tool allows us not only to click on the puppet pin and change its position like that, but we can also rotate it using that puppet pin tool. Okay, we're going to use one more puppet pin tool, but we're going to use the puppet position pin tool at the top of the list here, and I'm going to create one right at the wrist. Now let's take a look at what's happened in our arm layer in our layers panel. I'm going to select that layer and twirl down the effects button to reveal that there's an effect on here called puppet. And there's a number of properties, but underneath that there's something here called a mesh. And inside that mesh we can find puppet pin 2 and puppet pin 1. Let's make things a little bit easier on ourselves by just revealing those puppet pin properties by pressing U on our keyboard. You can see that puppet pin 1, because it was an advanced puppet pin, not only has its position property here, but it also has a scale property and a rotation property. And I have these keyframes right at the beginning of my timeline. Let's put Frank's arm in its neutral position by selecting puppet pin 2 in our layers panel, and if I hover over top of it you can see I have that puppet pin repositioning tool, and I'm just going to reposition the arm to a side like that. You can see there's a little bit of deformation here. I can fix that by changing puppet pin 1's rotation value and dragging it to the right so the arm is in a bit more of a neutral position to start with. Now that I've got the arm where I wanted to begin with, I'm going to move along my timeline using my current time indicator to the point of the animation where he stops his movement and looks to the right. From here, I'm going to hover over top of the rotation value and drag to the right, and I'm also going to click on puppet pin 2 and drag it up like so. If I click on the original anchor point down here, you can see I get the Bezier handles that allow me to define a curve for that movement. Okay. Now, you'll notice that I've changed the position value for puppet pin 2 and the rotation value for puppet pin 1, but I didn't do anything for the position or the scale value for puppet pin 1. But I still need to copy these keyframes by selecting them, pressing Command C, and then Command V to position those at this point in my timeline. If I didn't do that, we would get some awkward movements. Frankie holds his position for a number of keyframes. I'm going to reposition my current time indicator roughly to this point where he begins his movement again, and I'm going to just copy these keyframes like I did last time, Command C on my keyboard, and Command V, paste those roughly there. So the arm is going to stay in roughly that position during that period of time. I'm going to move to the next part of my timeline where the arm begins to move down. And again, I'm going to start this movement by changing the position value for anchor pin 1. I'm going to raise the arm, and I'm going to change the rotation value of the shoulder. He now bends his arm in the opposite way. Let's move along my timeline to the point where Frankie looks in the other direction. And at this point, I'm going to select both puppet pin tools by holding down the shift button. And now I can move them together like that. I'm going to finish off this animation by repositioning my current time indicator at the point where Frankie looks forward at us at the end of his movements. Let's copy these original puppet pin keyframes, Command C and Command V right here. One thing I didn't do here was add any easing to those arm movements, however, so let's do that last by selecting all of these keyframes, and I'm going to add some ease in, ease out value of roughly 80. Now, admittedly, this animation does need some work. The real takeaway from this exercise is realizing just how the puppet pin tool can be effective in certain situations.